it's Rachel. Apologies for not posting as frequently lately. As you can probably tell from behind me, I still don't have a garden. This is very much an active construction zone. I'll do a whole other video on how I'm dealing with that and the late start this year, but I do have a shed and I have a very large pile of compost. I'm going to need it because this is turning into a very large garden, and I thought it might be helpful for anybody else that is planning a larger garden and trying to grow more of their food kind of for real, for me to walk through how I decided exactly how big to make this thing. Every other property that I have been limited essentially by where I could fit the garden, and then I tried to maximize the amount that I produced out of the space. Here, I really could make it pretty much as big as I wanted, and I, for the first time, had to work through how big is big enough. I'm going to break this into 6 key steps. Steps 1 and 2 are highly related. These are your goals for the garden and consequently which crops you need to grow to hit those goals. Steps 3 and 4 are also highly related. This is about your rotational plan and consequently the standard unit size that you need to use for that, given what you want to grow. Topic 5 is perennials. This is one all unto itself because you don't need to rotate those, so you handle that very differently. And then finally, I want to talk about the non-growing area. I personally was surprised by how much square footage I had to dedicate to something other than growing food, and I thought it was worth covering as part of this video. Starting quickly with goals, I had 4 goals. One was to improve the quality and the nutritional content of my food, and growing it myself can do that. The second was around reducing my exposure to pesticides. I do have an autoimmune disease and I have to be pretty careful with what I expose myself to and what I put in my body. Third, I think this is probably shared by a lot of us right now, given what's going on with global inflation, but that was to reduce our family's grocery bill. And then fourth, always important for me, is thinking about how I can reduce my carbon footprint. One of the biggest contributors to our total carbon footprint is the food that we consume, and the more of that I can grow, the better. When I looked at those goals, the best way to achieve them varies a little bit, although some crops check multiple boxes. If I want to improve quality and nutrition, I need to focus on crops that perish or spoil easily during transportation. Those are going to be the ones that'll give me the best quality and nutrition if I grow them myself. The second goal, around pesticide use, I looked at the USDA Dirty Dozen list from 2022 and 2023 and made sure I tried to grow as many of those as I could. On the third topic of grocery costs, I went through US retail data for groceries across the country, and I pulled the highest expense items on a dollars per pound basis. The fourth topic for carbon footprint can get pretty complicated. In theory, we could go out and calculate the water requirements and the distance things are shipped. For the purposes of my own garden, I decided to just focus on growing things that my family consumes on a regular basis. That's one good proxy for reducing the total impact that we have from the food that we produce. Let me show you how this all added up to what I'm growing. Starting with perishable foods, you can see them here in dark green. Anything where I found data indicating that they perished quickly or spoiled during transport are in dark green. A couple of them here are in light green. Those also fit the criteria of spoiling during transportation, but they're available in frozen form widely, and hence you can still get a good, nutritious, and high quality product if you just buy them frozen. The next, around pesticide exposure, I looked at the Dirty Dozen lists. Any plant that made that list 2 years in a row is dark green. Anything that only made it 1 year is light green. When I went on to cost, I have data here. Quickly, I'll show as a chart. I pulled this and ranked from most expensive to least expensive. I went ahead and excluded animal products from this, and that's the second chart here. I'm not planning on raising my own meat. And so what that left me with, I then focused on just what are the top third most expensive items. And you can see that here in the third column of the table. And then last but not least, and this will vary for everybody, what are the things of which you consume a lot? And so I added a few more things onto this list that personally I know my family eats on a regular basis. In totality, I looked this over, found the things that checked multiple boxes, and then I've highlighted in yellow the things that I really very much want to include in the garden. The reason you need a standard unit. If you start growing a lot of your own food and you increase the size of your garden, rotation becomes much more important. It's important to make a distinction between what you want to grow for fresh eating and what you want to grow to preserve, store, can, etc. This is because the things that you want to grow for fresh eating often can be harvested multiple times and you don't need to take up as much space. Many of the things that you want to preserve ultimately are going to dictate the size of your garden. Let me start with what I personally grow for fresh eating. I do follow the Walls protocol as an anti-inflammatory diet. I'm trying to manage my multiple sclerosis, and I have 3 categories I try and eat quite a bit of. I've done a whole video before about how I handled crop rotations when I had a smaller garden, and I basically just broke my beds into 2 types. I had 4 of them. I had a standard unit that was 4 foot by 8 foot or 32 square feet. It was a small garden. I still wanted to practice rotation, and it was easier to do that if they were all the same size. The way that I handled it was to have half of them be spring and fall crops, and then the other half were used for summer and winter crops. I had a very simple rotation I've done a whole video on, where essentially I flipped back and forth. One year they would grow summer winter crops, and then the next year they would grow spring fall crops, and then the cycle would repeat. I still intend to grow beds of this type, but when I thought back to how much of our food we were able to produce out of those beds, it was probably about half of what I would have liked for fresh eating. And consequently, given that I not only want to grow as much of my own as I can, but I also would like to have a few things extra for storage, like some spinach I can blanch and freeze and things like that, I think need to multiply that bed space by about 4 to get to the point where I'm going to grow substantially most, if not all, of these crops out of my own garden. They were 32 square feet. If we multiply by 4, I'm looking at right around 120 to 130 square feet as one possible unit that I can use as I'm laying out this garden. Let's turn to foods that I want to keep in the freezer or in the pantry. First on the list is onion. I use an onion or 2 pretty much every meal that I make, about 3 pounds a week. Put that first. Next are potatoes and sweet potatoes. I've got both of those listed here as well. And then I tend to keep a ton of crushed tomatoes in the pantry, and I use a lot of them every week. I also keep frozen broccoli on hand. For each of these crops, I went through and added up how much of this my family eats in a week, and then I've expanded the table here to show what it would look like if I wanted to grow all of that myself. I've used the square feet per pound of average production on these vegetables, pulled that from the USDA, and I've translated that into the square foot required if I was going to grow all of it myself. I've grayed out the tomato and broccoli for a reason. These can be grown amongst other things. They're already part of my polyculture beds, and if I wanted to grow more of them in the garden, I can pretty easily spot them in wherever I need to. The onions, the potatoes, and the sweet potatoes are root crops. That is much harder. When you're growing root crops, to harvest them, you have to dig them up, and that makes them a very bad neighbor for anything else you might want to grow. Consequently, if you want to grow these, it really makes sense to devote one chunk of the garden to just that crop. Looking at the square footage that I would need for each of these 3, I'm right around that same, call it 120, 130 square foot mark on average if I wanted to grow a bed of nothing but these 3 things. Now right now I'm not planning on building raised beds back here. I've already redesigned this thing like twice. I do not believe it's going to stay static. I think I'm going to change this at least once more. But in the back of my mind, I was like, well, in theory, at some point I'll lock the design down, and I'd like to use dimensional lumber. So I was thinking about this in lengths of, call it, 8, 16, 24, so I could use an 8-foot standard lumber at some point. I then looked at trying to get to around 120, 130 square feet and having a depth of a bed that made sense. Where I landed was to have the beds be 7 feet wide with a 2-foot walkway down the middle. That gave me a 2.5 growing area on each side of that little access walkway. And I can do that with a 24-foot length and end up right at 120 square feet. That's what I decided to go with as my initial unit for this garden. Showing you a quick schematic here, I had the families color-coded in the lower right, and I used that to color-code the beds. I did keep the 4 polyculture beds. I will have 2 that are summer crops, winter crops, and 2 that are spring or fall crops. I then ended up with 6 beds that I really felt merited a large kind of monoculture type of growing. That was broccoli, and that will be underplanted with my garlic. The following year it becomes a potato bed and the garlic stays put until it's harvested. I also decided to dedicate an entire bed to tomatoes, even though I am growing them in the polyculture beds because I can never get enough tomatoes. I will have a whole tomato bed. I am growing quite a bit of squash. That's going to get its whole own bed. And then I have the root crops mentioned before of sweet potatoes and onions. And because I'm now getting into monoculture, I am worried about diseases and soil pressure and all of that. My rotation, as you might imagine, has gotten a lot more intentional. I did a video on this before. I'll quickly show you my 10-year rotation here. Again, the color coding reflects the families. The short version is that the placement of the Solanaceae family, potatoes, tomatoes, and peppers really dictated this entire rotation. Overall, I felt pretty good when I looked at this. 10 beds, roughly this big. I'm growing what I want to grow, and I should have about the right amount of space, plus or minus. This is all based on averages and is likely not going to be what I actually produce, but it seemed like a decent place to start. If I go with those 10 beds of the size that I mentioned and I lay them out in a grid of 5 beds by 2 wide with, call it 2 to 3 feet of access aisles around them, I land at a 53 foot by 53 foot growing area for my annual beds. Topic 5, perennials. You don't rotate perennials because they're perennial. They never go anywhere. The good news is you don't have to worry about rotations. The bad news is you have to worry about winter. Going back to that same table from before, I've highlighted in yellow all of the perennial crops on this page. And then you'll notice that I have grayed out nectarines and peaches. Well, I would love to grow those. I live in Michigan, and there is no way that a peach tree or a nectarine tree is going to survive my winters, so these guys are out. The other thing worth noting is that I'm going to have that Jaglone guild in the northeast corner of my property. I did a video on this when I did the overall design for this permaculture site, but there is going to be a perennial guild in the northeast corner of my property centered around things that can tolerate Jaglone, because there's a lot of it in the area, and pecan and walnut both met that criteria. Zooming in and showing the plan here, you can see I was also able to work in some hazelnut. Consequently, I don't need to work them into this garden area either, and you'll see going back to the same table, I've grayed them out as well. That leaves me with strawberries, blueberries, blackberries, and raspberries. I eat a ton of berries, and I would very much like to get them in this mix, as well as kind of more opportunistically, I'm gonna grow grapes, apples, and pears if I can. Those aren't nearly as much of a staple for my family as berries are, but we do enjoy them, we do like eating them, and they grow very well here in Michigan, and I think at some point I would like to try my hand at growing all of them. The other important thing about perennials, because they don't move, and because all of us tend to need to redesign our gardens, you gotta be careful about where you put them. In my case, because of the zoning of my property, I really cannot expand the garden any further to the north. It cannot go north of my house. I could expand it as far as I want to the south. Similarly, because of the setbacks and zoning, I can't really go to the west any further than I already am, and I could go a little bit east, but I'm already kind of close to the house. If I ever have to expand this garden, I would move that south fence. As a result, I have mentally designated the northern side of the garden as stuff that won't move. The shed is going along the north side, and then I'm going to build raised beds along the north that will house the perennials. That will be 53 feet wide to match the annual growing area below and create a continuous fence. The question was, how deep does this need to be? Because it's getting really windy and I'm losing my camera stability, I'm going to start flipping to schematics here so you can just look at that. The shed is a 12 foot by 16 foot shed, and I wanted to leave a 3 foot aisle next to it for access to the door. I knew I had 56 feet to work with overall, and I knew I wanted to do kind of this finger design to allow for a minimal amount of square footage to be used for these aisles for access. So the fingers coming down are 3 feet wide at the edges and then 4 feet wide in the middle, because those beds I can access from both sides. Those little aisle fingers are 2 feet wide. When I laid all of that out and worked on it a bit, I landed on 20 feet to the west of the shed and then a 14 foot wide area to the east of the shed. The question was, how long should these beds be? So in this drawing you can see X in red. Not to give you guys PTSD, algebra flashbacks, but essentially I had to solve for X. I did this by going in and focusing on the berries, since that's the majority of what I really care about growing here. They're much better eaten fresh. You can freeze them, you can dehydrate them, but it really changes the texture and the nutrition. And I wanted to try and have as an extended of a harvest as possible, which affected my selections here. I aimed for selections with a staggered harvest over time. Raspberries, blackberries, and blueberries were all on that list from before. I've added honeyberry because they happen to ripen sooner. Overall, my goal with berries is to eat about 1.5 pounds a week. That's about how much we buy at the grocery store today. 1.5 pounds a week yields 78 total pounds a year I'm trying to get here. And if I divide that by 5 types of berries that I plan to grow, I land on about 16 pounds of berries of each type that I would like to yield out of this area. I looked at how many square feet are required per plant and how many pounds are produced per plant, and then the implied pounds per square foot. Knowing my goals, knowing how many square feet are required to produce a pound, and going back and solving for X, I landed on X equals 9 feet. Because I have a 3 foot bed along the northern fence, and because I want to have a 3 foot aisle to the south, that total depth of the perennial area then needed to be the 9 feet plus 3, or 15 feet deep and 53 feet wide. Flipping back to the schematic view, what about the beds that are left? The other berry that we do eat a lot of is strawberries. The reason I didn't specifically include strawberries before is that they don't really have a set growing area. They will spread and cover everything. They're basically a ground cover. That can be helpful. It helps shade out weeds, it helps keep the soil moist, etc. but it doesn't really make sense to say I'm going to grow exactly this many square feet of strawberries. Nature just doesn't work that way. So I decided to focus on the other ones, design around them, and then put the strawberries wherever else I could. Realistically, they're not going to just stay in these areas. They're probably going to grow under the blueberries, etc. But for now, I'm going to act like they're only going to grow here to be conservative. And going back to my former table, but now adding a row for the strawberries, you can see that with 105 square feet that I plan on planting out to the strawberries, I'm going to end up with, in theory, 105 pounds of them. That'll be kind of all at once probably, but it's a nice yield and it works out to about 2 pounds a week. In reality, this is all going to hit me at once in June, so I will probably end up freezing, drying, making jam, whatever. I think of it as kind of just an extra bonus to get the strawberries, but I am happy that my family will have access to them. One more perennial we haven't talked about at all. It didn't hit any of the goals before, but it's asparagus. And asparagus grows very well with strawberries in terms of their growing habits and how you can plant them. And I do like to pair them. It isn't like a staple crop for my family, but I figured as long as I'm planting strawberries, let's go ahead and put in some asparagus. Going back to that schematic and looking at the ones highlighted here in yellow, you can see I have layered in asparagus along with the strawberries. And then going back to the table, I've added a row for asparagus. Overall, in theory, with this much square footage, once these things hit their maturity, I should get about 20 pounds off of these, which is the equivalent of roughly 27 bunches if I had bought them at the grocery store. You'll notice I said when they hit maturity. It's the important thing with perennials. They take a long time to start producing. They are an investment. You put them in, you wait. Sometimes 3, 4, 5 years before you really get a crop. I'm running the numbers off of the mature yields of these crops. The reality is I'm going to be still buying them at the store for at least a couple of years until these guys really hit their stride. That's fine. If anybody of you is really sharp-eyed, you might have noticed that one of my strawberry beds did not get co-planted with asparagus. And if you're wondering why, it is because of what I plan to grow on this wall. Rotating the schematic and looking here from another angle, wanted to flag what I'd mentioned before. I do want to try and grow pears and apples. We enjoy them, we like them. It'd be a fun crop to try and grow. I didn't want to dedicate a lot of space to them, and consequently, I am planning to have an espaliered pair of pear trees, 2 types for better cross-pollination, planted against the east side of the shed. And consequently, I did not plant asparagus below. Strawberries are fine. They'll be a nice ground cover. They'll keep the weeds at bay, etc. But the asparagus I felt like would just get in the way and potentially be damaged when I was trying to go in there and prune or otherwise work on those pears. I also showed espaliered apple trees in that diagram over at the gate, which will be right behind me. I may or may not do this, candidly. Might be too ambitious, and we actually have an old apple tree on the property that is not doing well, to put it mildly. But I think I could graft some branches on or do something else to try and get some interesting different types and mixes of apples growing on the property without too much work. I may go with an espaliered apple there at the entry, or I might just plant it with some kind of vine that pollinators will enjoy. Assuming for a moment that I do espalier both 2 pears and 2 apples, I've gone back to this chart and I'm showing the yield in totality of all of my perennial crops. And you can see I'm getting at, again, maturity, which is going to take a while, almost 400 pounds of food out of a 53-foot by 15-foot area, which is not bad. Okay, last, final, but important topic. Sounds boring, but it isn't. The non-growing area. This was way more than I expected it to be, which is why I thought I would flag it for you guys. First, if you've been wondering this whole time, why the heck do I have this double fence around the garden? The answer is zoning, striking once again. I cannot have a fence taller than 4 feet. It is what it is. And I have heavy deer pressure. There is no way a 4-foot fence on its own is going to keep the deer out. But I've done some research, and supposedly 2 4-foot tall fences with 4 feet in between, deer will not jump it. Apparently this is because they are not able to jump high enough and far enough to clear both 4-foot tall fences in a single leap, and they are unable to land in the middle and take off again if they are only 4 feet apart, and the deer will see this as a threat and they will be concerned about being trapped. Okay, I don't know if this is true. It'd be lovely if it was. As extra insurance, I am going to use this sort of moat as a dog run and have my dogs run around in there, pee, be happy, and hopefully mark the whole thing up and make it smell like a place a deer has no interest in being. Fingers crossed, this is the best I can do with my zoning. Taking the 53-foot by 53-foot, 53-foot by 15-foot, adding them together, and then going 4 feet in all directions, I ended up with an enclosed area of 61 feet by 73 feet, or 4,636 square feet in total. I've put together a Marimekko chart here for you because I love a good data chart, and I've broken this up into the growing area and the non-growing area, and you can see even if you get rid of the moat, like let's assume for a minute you don't have the same zoning problems I have, or you don't have any deer pressure, in which case I'm very jealous. You might not need that moat, and you might not decide to have a shed like I am. But even without those two, you'll be able to see these access aisles and walkways represent almost half of the total area that's enclosed in here. And that was with me trying to be as efficient as possible with like the finger design and the narrow walkways and all of it. Overall, I would suggest once you figure out the square footage that you think you need to grow the crops that you want to grow, double that to account for a roughly equal amount of space that you're going to need for just basic access. That is it. Those are all 6 topics. If anybody has questions, please let me know. I kind of went through a lot there. As much as I'm frustrated that I don't have a garden right now, the fact that I have been forced to sit here and just rethink this to death, honestly, I think has resulted in a better, more efficient layout. I hope you guys are already gardening, unlike me, and I hope that this was helpful, useful, and possibly can come in handy if any of you are going through the same process, especially those of you that are growing for real. I'd love to hear what you think about this and if I missed anything, because I still have time to incorporate it. I'm sure I've got another month of this before I can put stuff in the ground. So please let me know if I missed anything, and let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, until next time, thanks.